Share my screen here.
So welcome everyone. This is our fifth and our final Dairy Quiz Bowl workshops and Kahoot. We've tried to cover most of the areas of the dairy topic areas. And tonight we have Joe Lawrence with Pro Dairy, and he does the field crops portion. So he's a crop kind of guy. And so tonight he's going to give you a presentation about, I guess his title is Crops and Cows, and talk about that side of things. And then after he's finished, we will have our annual Kahoot.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and I thank him for being here tonight and sharing his knowledge. If you have questions, please ask them or put them in the chat, and we will definitely get those answered. This is all about learning and, kind of building the base for Quiz Bowl.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I kind of put this presentation together based on having reviewed some of the previous year's questions that were more related to crops and forages. There's also a little bit here on nutrient management. So as Debbie said, just put your questions in the chat and we'll go through anything. If there's something I don't cover that you want to, then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end. But it's you probably have talked about in some of your meetings and practices that one unique thing with dairy is it's a closed loop system, not completely, but for a good portion of it, we're feeding the crops that we grow on our land to the cows and then utilizing their manure as a fertilizer source to grow more crops. So it's a fairly unique system in that way compared to other parts of agriculture. And I know you've already learned, had some information on how the rumen functions and some dairy nutrition factors. And so what I wanted to start out, and part of what I'll share with you, is considerations for the crops we're growing to feed the cows, because growing forages to feed animals is a little different than growing corn or soybeans just to harvest for the grain or something like that. So we often hear about forage quality and the importance of forage quality for dairy cows and producing milk. But I often get asked what that means. And to me, there's kind of two parts of forage quality. There's the actual nutritional value of the forage. So you'd send a forage and sample to a laboratory and get an analysis back that would give you key information on some of the nutritional values of that forage that would be important for a nutritionist when they're balancing the diet for the cows. But then there's a feed value portion, and especially when we're making silages, it's there's a big factor is how well that crop ferments in the silo, how stable it is, if it's been contaminated at all, either during the harvest process or through the storage, if there's any molds or toxins in it, if it's corn silage, if it's been processed well, which we'll dig into a little more later, how it's been cut. Those things all affect how well the cow will utilize it. And in some cases, a forage could have a really high nutritional value based on the laboratory report, but some of these other factors, if they were not good, would limit the cow's ability to utilize that forage, even if it was, even if it looked good on paper, so to speak. So forage quality is, it really is critical to milk production and for beef cows, for growing efficient animal. And it's strongly linked to farm profitability. So feed costs are are the highest costs on a farm. And if we're producing high quality forages, the animals are getting more of the nutrients they need from the feeds we're growing on the farm. And so we have, we can buy less supplements to balance out the diet. And this graph is some older data, but it just shows it was a study where they took different qualities of alfalfa. So the red line, the lower NDF is the highest quality, and then it went down from there. And they looked at milk production based on the quality of that alfalfa with different levels of grain in the ration. And what you can see here is with the highest quality alfalfa in the diet, the milk production was the highest, even when it was a small amount of grain in the diet. And when even with the next lower quality alfalfa, the highest rate of grain, if you follow this back across, you're still not producing as much milk as they were with the lowest quantity of grain with the higher quality forage. So it makes a big difference in what what the cows can produce and how cost effective it is for you to feed those animals. So when we think about the major crops that we grow, corn silage is often thought of as a source of energy for the animals. And that's primarily coming from the starch that's in the kernels of corn. And we think of hay as a protein source, or really it's a source of amino acids. Now we would talk about it in that context. But that's kind of the traditional way of thinking of it. Now we tend to think of it, the total digestible nutrients or digestible fiber that you're getting from that forage. So the more of that that's digestible to animal, they can utilize. And you've already had some information on rumens and from people that are actually experts on that. I'm a crop guy, not a cow guy, so this is my very rudimentary crop person version of what's going on here. But when we think about the digestibility of the feed, there's a certain amount that's actually it's actually important to have some of that undigestible fiber in the feed because it creates that rumen mat and helps with stability in the rumen. So it can, even though we want high quality feed, it can be a bad thing to have too high a quality feed because we don't have enough of that fiber rumen mat to help with stability. On the other hand, if we have too much of that undigestible fiber in the rumen, it makes the cow feel full and she doesn't want to eat anymore. But she's not getting the nutrients that she needs from it. So that's why the quality of that forage, the digestibility of the fiber and the nutrients in that forage is so important to balance out what the cow needs and how much she's going to eat. So for our hay crops, the biggest factor that impacts forage quality is stage of growth. It's critical to harvest hay crops, especially grasses, before they put out a seed head. Once you see a seed head on a grass plant, the quality is drastically declined. So harvesting early, especially for lactating cows, to capture that higher quality feed is very important. With corn silage, because that is a mature plant that's already produced grain and is drying down in the field, stage of growth is still important because we want a mature ear on that plant to get that starch that we're looking for. But we also look at whole plant dry matter. How dry is that plant standing in the field? Because as you may know, with a hay crop, we mow it down and then we let it sit in the field to dry until it's ready to harvest. Where corn, it's drying on its own in the field and we're directly cutting it. So it needs to be at the right whole plant dry matter to when you harvest it in order to ensile properly, ferment properly, and make a good feed. So this is an example of a hay crop, a grass hay crop in the spring of the year. And there's a trade-off here. So the red line is that total amount of fiber. The NDF is the neutral detergent fiber, and this is the total amount of fiber and the yield of the crop. And as we progress through the spring and the weather gets warmer, we'll see that crop continue to grow. But as it grows, it's also accumulating more fiber. The blue line, on the other hand, is the represents the crude protein and the digestibility. So we have that neutral detergent fiber NDF with a D on the end, which stands for digestibility. So that's how digestible it is. So we have this going in the opposite direction, where protein content and the digestibility of the fiber are going down. So what we're really trying to do with the first cutting of our crop is hit this kind of compromise in the middle, where we have enough yield that it makes it worth harvesting, but the quality is still pretty good. Because if we wait until we get it way out here after it's headed out and it's reached its maximum yield, we've lost a lot of the quality. And then even though we have a lot of tons of it, it's really not very valuable to us as a feed. On the corn silage side, essentially corn is a grass plant, but what it is it's a mature grass plant with an ear on it. So it's really grass plus grain. So it's the grass part of it, the stalk, is just like any other grass plant, may not be as digestible when it's as mature like this, but because you have that grain portion of it, it's really important to making an overall high quality feed. So these are just some of the parameters of the dry matter contents that we would target in our forages, and it does vary a little bit by type of silo that you're using. And some of the major points that are going to impact the quality of that forage are the dry matter moisture, and for the silo you're putting in it, the length of cut, which we'll get into a little bit more. And then we'll talk a little bit more about these concepts here. So when we want to dry a hay crop forage, we want to dry it as quickly as possible. We want to limit the time that it's in the field weighing in a windrow. The longer it's laying in the windrow, the more quality that we're losing. So we want to mow it down, dry it as quickly as possible, and get it into the silo or the bale or whatever you're using. So to do that, one of the best strategies is to lay it out wide, because then it's shallower, the sunlight can get to the whole windrow, and it dries much more uniformly and faster. If we have a narrow, thick windrow, we end up with drying that's not uniform, and we see where the outside could be overly dry and crispy, but it's still very wet in the middle, and it takes longer to you have to leave it in the field longer before you harvest or chop it or bale it. And that's problematic because we're losing sugar content out of the forage the longer it's laying there, mowed down in the field. And that's reduces the quality. It also reduces its ability to ferment well in the silo. So we want to avoid situations like this where we're putting a lot of material into one big windrow, and you end up again with it kind of being warm and or hot and dry and crispy on the outside and still sopping wet on the inside. The ideal way to do a wide windrow is to have the windrow behind the machine be at least 80% of the cutter bar. So to make the math easy, as a way to think about this, if you had a 10-foot wide mower that cut 10 foot at a time, 80% of that is 8 feet. So if you measured that windrow behind a 10-foot wide mower, you would want that to be at least 8 feet wide. and that's going to give you a quick uniform drying. Another impact is that length of cut of the forage. If it's cut too long, cows are more likely to sort it in their feed, and we don't want them to do that. When they take a bite of the feed, if the grain's mixed into it, like in a TMR, we want them every bite to be uniform, and we don't want them sorting out the longer particles. So that's a risk if we cut our crops too long. But on the other side, if we cut it too short, it could pass through the cow too quickly. It won't stimulate enough cud chewing, and you know, it's back to that picture I showed before of, or my little drawing of the rumen with too little UNDF in it. It passes through too quickly. It could be a problem. And many nutritionists use this Penn State particle separator. It's 4 different shelves with different size holes in them to look at the silage and see if it's cut the right length. So here's an example of that in the field, where I was in the field with a farm that was harvesting. I took a sample of the corn silage and shook it through the Penn State particle separator, and then you weigh what's on each screen, and there's recommendations from Penn State University on how much what percentage of your sample should be on each screen. So here's the one for corn silage. There's a different set of numbers for haylage, and there's a different set of numbers for the total mix, the TMR that you mix together. But these are the corn silage numbers, and this is what you'd be looking for in the 4 different boxes of the particle separator. So kernel processing is essentially breaking over open kernels of corn inside the silage. So just like you may be familiar with feeding corn meal, which is ground up grain, so we don't feed the whole kernels of grain, right? We feed it ground up as corn meal or steam flake corn or something like that. Well, it's the same thing in silage. And the analogy that a friend of mine shared with me was, you know, how would you like to eat your candy bar? Do you eat your candy bar with the wrapper still on it, or do you take the wrapper off to eat it? And that's really what we're doing with corn kernel processing of corn silage. There's a waxy coating around the kernel that the microbes in the rumen can't get through. So if a cow eats a whole kernel of corn, it sits in her rumen, the microbes can't get to it, and it often passes right through as a whole kernel into her manure. The microbes are never able to get to the good stuff inside. But if we crush it up, break it up well with a kernel processor, then the microbes are able to get the good stuff, the candy that's inside those kernels, and take advantage of it. This is just some examples. There's a kind of a cool YouTube video. I can put the link in the chat that shows a computer generated simulation of what the chopper is doing to the silage and how the kernel processor works. And here's just out of a fact sheet from Wisconsin, looking at different sizes of particles. And so you can read here that only the material on the far right side could be considered adequately processed. So even though these kernels are broke up, they're still kind of too big to really be effective in the rumen. And there's some different strategies you can use in the field. Like some companies have give out these cups, and it's a pretty simple, quick thing to do in the field, but you take a scoop of the silage to fill the cup and dump it out and sort out the kernels. And ideally you want to find less than 1 whole kernel in that scoop of silage you took. Shredlage is another concept that you may have a question about. And it's the idea that instead of finely cutting the silage into with sharp knives, that you're kind of ripping it. You're almost ripping it. So you can see this, it's a little blurry maybe, but hopefully you can tell this picture of the shredlage looks more ripped apart with different length pieces, where the traditionally processed corn silage it's more finer cut, like cutting something with a sharp knife. And so the idea with shredwood is it provides you some variation in particle size, but you're still getting good processing of the kernels. And this can be a benefit for some diets. It really depends on what other ingredients you're feeding. Because I often get asked about like, well, what's the ideal corn silage or what's the ideal haylage? And really, the answer is it depends on what else you're feeding along with it. So a nutritionist feeding cows on one farm may have a slightly different strategy than on another farm based on the ingredients the farm has available to it to feed. But shredwood is a unique type of chopping action that can be beneficial in terms of the particle size it gives you for some feeding programs. So the other thing is, we ferment silages to help stabilize them. They become stable and we can store them for a long time, but they can also help improve the quality of the feed. In the case of sometimes with hay, a chopped up haylage that's soft and moist from fermentation can have a softer texture and be more palatable to the cow than a dry hay that might be sharp and stocky. With corn silage, we know that if we leave that silage in the bunk for 3 to 4 months or in the silo for 3 to 4 months, that it increases the amount of the starch that's digestible by the cow. But this is where it's important to remember that the digestibility of the starch is different than the availability. So, and that gets back to that kernel processing. So the starch could be very digestible after it's been in the silo for 3 to 4 months. But again, if those are whole kernels, it doesn't matter if it's really digestible starch because the bugs in the rumen can't get to it. But if we break those kernels open, we have better availability of that starch. There's also some anti-quality parameters for forages. As we already talked about, if it's over mature and that fiber is not digestible, if it's too wet or too dry, it may not ferment properly, and you may get spoilage instead of a nice stable fermentation. If you have a poorly set up storage structure and you can't, especially if you can't exclude all the oxygen from that feed and put a good plastic cover over it, you can get a poor fermentation and drastically more spoilage from that feed if you're not keeping the oxygen away from it. If you get contaminated with soil or old manure or something from the field during the harvest process, you can introduce some bad bugs that instead of getting a good fermentation, they lead to molds and toxins, and as well as additional ash content, which is essentially soil minerals that are not digestible to the cow, but they take up room. So if the cow's eating a forage with a lot of ash in it, that ash is sitting in her rumen making her feel full, but she's not getting any nutritional value from it. So there's several types of molds, which are essentially types of funguses, and they can enter the forage either through the living plant. So sometimes especially if we have a wet, damp growing season, we can see molds develop on the plants in the field. And then when we harvest those plants, we're bringing that mold into the silo with us. Or we can see sometimes, if we don't have good fermentation of the silage, that there's certain types of molds that could grow in the forage. Think about something old and moldy in the back of your fridge, or if you try to compost something, we can end up with that sort of issue. And this creates problems because it could make the feed heat or smell bad or taste bad, or even cause health issues for the animal. So either it could make that cow not want to eat the feed because it's hot or tastes or smells bad, or she could eat it and end up having some sort of health issues, just like a a person might get like food poisoning or something from eating a spoiled food. And then mycotoxins are a different thing than a mold. They're actually produced by a mold. And a good analogy that was shared with me is think of the fungus, the mold, the fungus as a skunk, and it might spray or it might not spray. Well, the spray from the skunk is the equivalent of the mycotoxins. They're toxins that are produced by the mold. So sometimes that skunk may or may not spray depending on if it's scared or stressed out. It's the same thing with the toxins. That the fungus may or may not produce toxins depending on if it gets stressed out. So it's important to remember mycotoxins are not a living thing. They're a toxic compound that's produced by the mold, which is a living thing. We can't see it with the human eye, can only detect it with lab tests, and these mycotoxins can create a number of health issues in cattle. So what are we doing when we make silage? We're essentially utilizing microbes, these bugs that are everywhere in the environment, that to stabilize that feed. And they do this based on the environment they're in. So there's different types of bugs. Our good bugs are gonna essentially use up essentially eat some of the sugars and energy that's in that forage. And as they do that, they're going to produce acid, which is going to lower the pH. And as it lowers the pH of that silage, eventually they basically kill themselves. The bugs produce so much acid and the pH gets so low that all the bugs die. We now have a forage that's sitting in a low pH environment where a lot of other molds cannot grow, and we have a stable feed. Some of these good bugs are also used for cheese making or bread, yeasts that make bread rise and different foods we have. But then there's the bad bugs that create rot, odor, toxins, and these are, generally associated with oxygen and with environments that are often, maybe too wet. So if we don't pack all the oxygen out of our silage, if there's still a lot of oxygen in there and it's really wet, we can end up with some of these bad bugs that kind of have a field day on us and outnumber the good bugs. And so that in that case, we get a spoiled feed instead of a good, stable silage. So again, to do this, we're looking for these good bugs, these bacteria. They're gonna eat some of the sugar in the forage. That's gonna get rid of the oxygen. The pH, they're gonna produce acid. The pH drops. We get a whole flush of bacteria, but then as the pH drops, the bacteria start to die off, and we see a drop off in the bacteria, a lower pH, and we enter that stable phase of the silage. So as we think about the differences between fermentation, compost, rot, those sort of things, essentially when we compost, we want to introduce oxygen. So this is a compost turner that's turning the compost, introducing oxygen. If you may have a compost barrel in your backyard, and ideally when you put new stuff in your compost barrel, you rotate it around, introduce oxygen into that. That's how you get a nice compost and not rot. Again, on the other hand, when we want to ferment and stabilize a feed, we need to exclude all the oxygen from it to get that fermentation from the bugs that don't want the oxygen. And then rot is when we haven't, is a little different than composting, because now we haven't created an environment for those bugs to break down the organic material. We just have different funguses and stuff growing on them, and that's different as well. I mean, and some people would say creating silage is kind of like pickling, in the sense that when you pickle something, oftentimes you're excluding oxygen and lowering the pH to essentially kill off any bugs that could be in there so that you can preserve that food. So what are some of the enemies of a good fermentation? Well, for the most part, it's anything that's going to allow oxygen in or prevent the silage from being packed well. So this is an example of a bunk silo that's not packed well because it's so steep on the sides, you can't drive the tractor on it. So maybe the middle part here is packed pretty well, but these sides and the top are not going to be packed well because it was too steep to drive the tractor on. The other problem we see here is that if you cut back too much plastic at one time, you're leaving all of this exposed feed. And if you don't feed through it fast enough, it can begin to spoil on you before you start to feed it. This is an example where a farm had some extra silage and put it in a just in on the ground. That's challenging because the ground's not as hard as concrete, and it's very hard to pack it well against just the ground underneath. Plus, they were in the mud trying to get it out. So you can see these piles of spoilage here. This farm ended up throwing away almost 50% of what they put in that pile. And then this is an example of a hailstorm that hit an ag bag, couple ag bags, and the extent the farmer went to try to repair those bags to keep the oxygen out so all of that feed in there would not spoil. So as we use more and more bunk silos and we have to pack them with tractors to get the oxygen out and pack it well, there's a rule of 800 for density. So the idea is that you want to have 800 pounds of tractor weight packing per ton of forage you're delivering per hour. So if you were using silage wagons or dump trucks and it was bringing in 45 tons of feed per hour, you would multiply that by 800 pounds, and you would need to find enough tractors. This could be one tractor, it could be 2 or 3 tractors, but you'd want to find about 36,000 pounds of tractor weight to pack that down if you were bringing in 45 tons per hour. And this postcard here is something we came up with where you could find your delivery rate. Say you were bringing in 100 tons per hour, follow it over until you get into the green, and then look up here to figure out how many tons of tractor weight you would need to adequately pack that in the bunk. So ways we can effectively pack are we want to pack it as well as we can. We can add extra weight to these tractors with like something like a concrete block to get extra weight on the bunk. We can add, here we have 3 tractors also, as well as a vibrating roller. Some farms are either purchasing or renting these vibrating rollers to help pack, just like you'd see in road construction. And then, with baleage, we want to get those bales wrapped as quickly as possible, ideally within 4 to 6 hours. That some studies have shown you can go up to 24 hours and still get them wrapped and have a reasonable job. But I say, why wait? If something broke down or you were in a bind, and you could potentially wrap it up to 24 hours later and still get a decent fermentation, but there's more risk of things going wrong. So ideally, you're gonna wrap these bales as quickly after you've baled them as possible to get that oxygen out of there and start the fermentation process. Oops. Another aspect of silage is leachate, and this is an issue, especially if it leaves the site and gets into a water body, because this leachate has what's called a high biological demand. It essentially steals oxygen from the water. And, when we take oxygen out of the water, it can affect the wildlife that are in the water. So either animals, fish, or vegetation. So farms have these systems in place where they collect the leachate coming from the bunk, and then they can spread that with their manure or deal with it in some other way and prevent it from getting into a road ditch or something like that. So now I'm going to shift gears to a totally different topic. And related to the nutrients that crops need. So the nutrients we kind of break down into the elemental hydrogen and oxygen, which are in their atmosphere. Our macronutrients, which we really focus on when we're fertilizing crops, are our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then a number of secondary and micronutrients that the crops need, but in much smaller quantities. And many people call manure a multivitamin because manure has a lot of these micro and secondary nutrients in it at small levels. So we get the big macronutrients, but we also get some of these where, like a grain farmer who's only growing corn and soybeans and doesn't have any manure to use, they may have to buy additional fertilizer to supplement that. But that manure can be a multivitamin for us on the dairy farm. So focusing in on the macronutrients, nitrogen, it's mobile in the plant, but it's also mobile in the soil, so it can leach away. So that's something we have to manage, is that if we get a rainstorm after we've put fertilizer on or manure, some of that nitrogen could leach so deep in the soil that the roots can't reach it anymore. Phosphorus, mobile in the plant, which means it moves around in the plant. So as new plant growth occurs, the plant may take the phosphorus from an old leaf and move it into a new leaf, but it's not mobile in the soil generally. That means that you could still lose it if soil erodes away, but it binds to the soil particles, so it's not going to leach to the soil like nitrogen does. And then potassium, mobile in the plant and the soil. So when we think about this, some of our considerations here, nitrogen can be a challenge if we're in a droughty conditions because there's no water there for it to solubilize in and be taken up by the plant. Too much nitrogen in the plant at ensiling can lead to high nitrate levels in the forage. This is more of a problem if you're feeding forage fresh, or if cows are eating it fresh on pasture or green chop. High nitrate levels can be a problem. If the forage is allowed to ferment for a few months in the silo before you feed it, those problems go away, and we can have losses from the field through leaching, where the phosphorus losses from the field are going to come more from erosion, where it's attached to the soil particle and it's leaving the field because the soil particle is leaving the field. So the macros, again, used in the highest amounts by the plants. Which macro is present in the atmosphere? It'd be nitrogen as an N2 gas. But how can that gas form be used by the plants? These are some of the questions you might get. So leguminous plants like soybeans or alfalfa or clover are called legumes, and they have a symbiotic relationship with some bacteria that live on their roots that actually take the N2 gas out of the atmosphere and convert it into a nitrogen form that can be used by the plant. What soil factor impacts this? pH. So those bacteria that live in the roots of the plant require a pH that's near neutral. So if we've learned about pH, 7 is neutral, and pH is a measure of acidity, as we talked about with the silage. And for the most part, we want to use calcium and magnesium that are in pulverized limestone to help us raise pH in the soil, and most of our plants prefer a pH around neutral. And again, the plant prefers it, but in the case of legumes, those bacteria that live in the roots also prefer that more neutral pH, and that's where they thrive and can take that atmospheric N2 nitrogen and convert it into a plant available form. This just shows that some nutrients are the wider bar means they're more available. So you can see at a neutral pH, most of our nutrients, especially our macronutrients, are most available to the crop when the pH is near neutral. And if our pH gets too low or too high in some cases, the bar gets narrower, which means that nutrient is less available to the crop. Fertilizer labeling, we're focused on the macronutrients. There's generally 3 numbers on the tag: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They're shown as percentages. So what that means is, like, if you had a bag that was triple 19 NP and K, it's 19% of each. So for easy math, if you had a 100-pound bag and there's 19% of each nutrient, that means there's 19 pounds of N, 19 pounds of P, and 19 pounds of K. Or I should say K is the short for potassium. So a little fertilizer math. If the question asks you apply 150 pounds per acre of a triple 19, remember it's got 19% of each of those nutrients in it. So how much did you apply? Well, you would take 150 pounds times 19%, or that's 0.19, and you would find out that you applied 28.5 pounds of nitrogen. And in this case, because they're all the same number, you would have applied 28.5 pounds of each nutrient. Another way you could find this in a recommendation is you could send a soil test to the lab and they could tell you needed 52 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And the fertilizer you have available to you is a 20-12-12. So remember, P, phosphorus, is our middle number. So 12%, and we need 52 pounds per acre. So what we would do here is take 52 pounds per acre, divide it by 0.12 or 12%, and it would tell us that we would need to apply 433 pounds of, oops, I got my numbers wrong here, but of that 20-12-12 fertilizer to get our 52 pounds of just the phosphorus. So I'm going to shift gears again to some other material you might see on the in the quiz. So terminology, we often hear these days about GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. That's a term for a plant or an animal that's been modified. Its genetics have been modified in agriculture. We're often doing that to get a trait that we want. But really, we've been modifying organisms for thousands of years by selecting the best fruit or the best vegetable and then saving the seeds from that and planting it again next year. We've been modifying our stuff that way. A better term for what we do in modern times is genetic engineering, or transgenic, where we've taken an organism that contains certain genetic material and we move that to an unrelated organism. And these are really better terms for what we're doing. There's a big advantage to this, actually, in that we know exactly what's happening. In the past, if we just had one watermelon that grew better than the other watermelon, we didn't really know why that was happening, but we would save the seeds from the watermelon we liked better. Where now we can determine exactly what caused that watermelon to be better than the other one, and understand that genetically why that watermelon was better and what changes were made. So commonly with field crops that we deal with, we're mostly looking at genetically engineered crops that have been engineered to tolerate a herbicide. So a herbicide may have killed that crop before, but if you have a tolerant version of, like, a corn plant, you can spray that herbicide over it. The herbicide will still kill the weeds, but it won't kill the corn plant. We have genetically engineered plants that have a tolerance to certain pests. The pests don't like to eat the plant, or the pest is harmed by the genetics of the plant. But these are all safe for humans because humans have a very different digestive tract than our insect pests do. So, these can be toxic to an insect pest, but they've been shown to be safe with humans. And then there's actually some companies that have found, certain genes in the plant that help with drought tolerance. And so as we think about droughty conditions, growing crops in different environments around the world, understanding what genes make that plant more drought tolerant can help our crops be more productive in different environments. There is one that's those are all like kind of pest protection ones. There's a more recent example that is where they've actually lowered the lignin, the fiber level in the alfalfa to make it higher quality. And so that one isn't to help manage pests, it's to make that alfalfa a more valuable feed for the animals. Another topic that you might see on the quiz, cover crops. These are generally considered crops that we plant when our primary crop is not growing. So instead of leaving the soil bare all winter, they help protect the soil from heavy rains, from erosion, from snow runoff, that sort of thing. And they can also absorb nutrients that are left there in the fall of the year and hold them over the winter. So the next spring, those nutrients are available to the crop. And there's a couple terms. Green manure means we terminate that cover crop in the spring and leave the dead biomass in the field. Double cropping means we would harvest that crop in the spring of the year as a forage. And here's some examples of cover crops we use in New York. So that's what I had for you for material. Sorry if I ran a little long here, Debbie, but.
No, that was great, Joe. Are there any questions from the peanut gallery? So I have a question, and it was in some regards to, you just mentioned it with the alfalfa, and the lignin levels. So yeah, so that genetically engineered field crop, that the alfalfa that has a lower lignin level, are you able to harvest that sooner or later than normal timelines based on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually farms use both of those strategies. So because it's lower lignin, higher quality, actually the two strategies that are used, first you could harvest at the same time you normally harvested your alfalfa, but get higher quality than you would have with the normal alfalfa. The second strategy that's often used is you can actually harvest it later. And if we think back, I don't know if I'll give you a headache scrolling all the way back through here, but if we think back to all the way to the beginning here, this one, what we could do with that low lignin alfalfa is harvest it over here where it's yielding more, but we're still getting the same quality we would have of harvesting a normal alfalfa back here where the lines cross. So some farms say I'm going to harvest it at the same timing and get higher quality. Some farms say I'm going to delay harvest, get higher yield, and get the same quality I would have gotten out of my conventional alfalfa. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So
we have a question here. What is the waxy layer on the corn kernel called, if it has a name?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's the seed. I mean, there's a couple different names. I often just refer to it as the seed coat. But there's I'm just looking if I have it here. I guess I didn't have it in here. So there's technically a couple different layers. There's a pericarp and couple different, but if you just seed coat is a pretty common term that would be used.
Okay.
Look and see if I have a picture of the actual breakdown of it. I might be able to find a picture that actually has a corn kernel shut out open and shows the different layers of it. Is there any other questions?
I don't see any in the chat. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Why can't cows digest lignin?
That's a good question. I'm not the perfect person to answer it, but I'll do my best. So actually they can digest more of it than a human can. So ruminant, that's one of the powers of a ruminant, is they can digest more of that fiber, more of the components of the plant, the lignin, the fibers, than a human can, but they still can't digest all of it. There's a certain fraction that's just, it's such tightly bound cells, tightly bound material that that the bugs just aren't able to break it down, at least in a timely manner. There's they actually use different time points when they look at how digestible a feed is, and they'll look at how much of it digests in the first 12 hours it's in the rumen versus how much of it digests in 30 hours or even a longer time point than that. So there's some of the very, the easily digestible stuff is going to break down first. And then at those longer time points, it's going to be that more tougher stuff that it takes the bugs longer to break down. And then there's going to be a fraction that just is never digested before it leaves the rumen. And in that case, it doesn't necessarily mean it could never be digested. It just means it's not able to be digested in the time period that it's in the rumen. So if you think of like a termite, termites have the power of living off of and breaking down fibrous materials too, and they kind of take it to an extreme because they're eating wood, which is a really dense source of fiber that even cows can't really break down very well. So I hope, not sure if that quite answered it, but
Does anybody else have any questions?
I didn't find my picture of corn kernel, but I did just find a nice picture on a corn seed website. I'll post the link in the chat, so you can see that seed coat. The outside is the pericarp, as I mentioned, and then it shows the other components of the kernel. And I'll also put that link to that. There's a YouTube video that shows that how the chopper cuts and kernel processes the silage. So I'll post a link to that as well if anyone is interested in seeing how the inner workings of the chopper work.
Well, thank you, Joe. Really appreciate you sharing your field crop knowledge, and you'll get lots of thank yous in the chat. It was a great presentation and lots of information. We did record this, and we will record through the Kahoot also, but and so then these are uploaded into the 4-H. We have a 4-H YouTube channel, I call it, and so we get lots of requests for from people who want to take these and listen to them again. Kids can just, turn them on and listen to them and watch them. So you're going to get lots of views on your YouTube channel from this also. So with that, I'm going to pull up our Kahoot. And we will, I gotta find my Kahoot, but. All right. We will do our Kahoot on crops. Why do I always have trouble with the Kahoot part? Finding it. I go to share my screen. I know I have it up. Bear with me. There we go. Are you guys seeing that now? Somebody give me a thumbs up.
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect.
It's there.
All right, get ready, because your pin is coming up. I know you guys know what to do because we've been doing this.
Looks like there's 22 in, so we probably have most everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, Deb, I know Rebecca had asked if they were in. She wasn't sure.
They're asking if their name shows up.
Yeah, in the comments she had put, "Are we in?" I'm not sure. I did ask her what name they signed in under. Uh, Signed in under Connie, so
Under Tommy, I don't see a Tommy.
Connie with a C. So did you scan the QR code or go to kahoot.it?
Is she responding?
Seen anything else? Yep, they think they're doing it now.
Okay. I'll give them a minute or so, or 30 seconds, I'll get in. I think they're in. That was Rebecca's Ravens. All right. Gonna hit the start. What is the planting process called when crops are planted without plowing or disking the field? Broadcasting, no-till, grafting, or drilling? Good job. The answer is no-till. Excellent. What type of crop shields the soil to reduce erosion? Cover crop. Good job. You guys are right on it tonight. A plant that is seeded each year and whose growth cycle is complete in 1 year is called what? A perennial, a cover crop, an annual plant, or a legume? Good job, an annual plant. What part of the plant is affected first by copper toxicity in the soil? The roots, the leaves, the stem, the flower? The roots. You guys are smoking tonight. The roots is correct. True or false? If the soil is acidic, that means it has a pH lower than 7. True, that is true. Below 7 is acidic. Above 7 is basic. Why would you add lime onto crop fields? To lower soil pH, to increase soil pH, or to keep the soil pH the same? The correct answer is to increase the soil pH. Lime will help make an acidic soil more basic, or just to increase up the pH. It may not be basic, but to increase the pH. Routine soil sampling for fields requires how many core samples per field? 1 to 2, 10 to 15, 5 to 7, or 20 to 25? The correct answer is 10 to 15. Regarding crops, what does SCS stand for? Good job. Soil Conservation Service. You purchased 100 pounds of 10, 12, 15 fertilizer. How many pounds of nitrogen are in the fertilizer? 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 12 pounds, or none? Good job. NPK, N is nitrogen, and that's that first number, so 10 pounds. What corn forage is typically harvested with a forage harvester equipped with an ear snapper header? Shelled corn, cornmeal, cracked corn, or snaplage? The correct answer is snaplage. Which of the following is classified as a legume? Corn, triticale, alfalfa, or fescue? Excellent job. Alfalfa. So you get multiple answers for this. Which of the following field management practices would reduce soil erosion? Windbreaks, reduce tillage, cover crops, strip cropping. You all were right, because all of them are correct answers. All of those processes below will help reduce soil erosion. Planting ryegrass will help remove what mineral from the soil? Calcium, potassium, phosphorus, or nitrogen? I'll give you a clue. I don't know the answer to this question. So the correct answer is phosphorus. Bermuda, Timothy, broom, and orchard are all types of what? Legumes, grasses, corn, or sunflowers? Great job. Grasses is correct. What is the term used to describe the process when minerals, especially nitrogen, are removed from the soil by water? Is it leaching, evaporation, absorption, or fertilizing? Nice work. Yes, it is leaching. It leaches out of the soil. True or false? The indigestible portion of the plant is called lignin. And we had a question about this. I think Tyler maybe had the question. He talked, Joe talked a little bit more about what lignin is. That is correct. It is the part of the plant that is not digestible or not digested very easily. You can have multiple answers here. What component are enemies of silage fermentation? Water, oxygen, sun, wind. Water and oxygen. What is the term for large round bales of silage that are wrapped in plastic? Is it called hay, haylage, snaplage, or baleage? Good job, baleage. What is the name for plants that have a life cycle of more than 2 years? Perennial, cover crop, annual, or legumes? That's excellent. Perennials. Perennial plants. Number 20. Drought-stressed forages often will contain toxic levels of what substance? Phosphorus, nitrates, calcium, or potassium? Nitrates. That was a good job, you guys. You're doing really well tonight. Not that you haven't done well all the other times, but this is I think sometimes a more difficult subject because we don't pay as much attention to it, and I think you guys are doing excellent. Foliar diseases which reduce a plant's photosynthetic capacity affect which part of the plant? And it is the leaf. Good job. True or false? An agronomist is an expert in the science of soil management and crop production. True. What process in the plant is carbon dioxide taken in from the atmosphere and then oxygen is released? Leaching, root compaction, photosynthesis, or sprouting? Excellent. Photosynthesis. What color are healthy alfalfa roots? Black, green, brown, or white? Awesome. White is the correct answer. And 25. In the area of crop and field work, a rut is considered anything deeper than how many inches? 1 inch, 5, 3, or 7 inches? 3 inches. I didn't know the answer to that one either. Good job. Awesome job, everyone. Well, awesome job, everyone. Thank you again, Joe, for your presentation on crops this evening. This is the last of our series of 5 different workshops and cahoots, preparing and doing some Dairy Bowl. All of these have been recorded and we will have them, they are posted in a YouTube. Following this, there will be a short survey that will be sent out, kind of an evaluation and kind of trying to get some input, how you like this, things that we could add to it, do differently. We try to keep these, within an hour and a half. In the evening, we'll send you the link to the YouTube and you'll have the presentation and everything. And I think the cahoots are in there also. And we thank you for being here over the last, I guess, almost month and a half. And we hope it's helped you prepare a little bit, learned a little bit, and helped you prepare for your regional dairy quiz bowl, and then some of you would be state dairy bowl quiz bowl. Thank the dairy committee also for their help in putting this together, and also for all the speakers. We have Joe on, but there's been other speakers that that you've met and has presented, and we hope you've enjoyed it. So with that,
Yep, just a plug for the dairy judging that we're going to be doing in
Yes.
May.
Yeah.
So be watching. We will set up a registration and be sending out links to register for dairy judging.
yes, thanks, Jen. We are going to set up, like Jen said, I think we're going to do 3 sessions. We're going to have them continued on Thursday nights in May. So those of you that are interested in dairy judging and want to learn a little bit more about that, we're going to do it the same time in the evening, probably the same time frame, and do different sessions. We'll get that ironed out with, you know, what will be in each of those presentations. And so we'll practice and get ready to doing some dairy judging. Doug Waterman and Kevin Zimba. And I think we may have another person in there that's going to help teach those. So stay tuned for more information on that. Thanks, Jen, for reminding me of that.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.